death doesn't matter in superhero comics. This is a very common thing said about superhero comics because of the countless times Marvel and DC characters have died and come back in new convoluted ways. Death as a concept is widely scoffed upon by readers even though it always manages to get the headlines and the attention from them. It is not a surprise that this is the common attitude held by most fans. Marvel and DC have killed off so many of their characters and have always somehow brought them back. Sometimes it takes weeks, sometimes it takes months, sometimes it takes years, sometimes decades, but somehow they all seem to come back in one way or another. You could argue it all started in the 90s with the highly publicized death of Superman storyline and then the return of Superman storyline, but to be honest, this was present in some capacity even before that. Sure, it wasn't as apparent then as it has been over the last 20 years or so, but it was always there in some capacity. Of course, there are a few exceptions to this, but this holds true for 99% of deaths in superhero comics featuring extremely relevant superhero characters. There used to be a small list a few years ago about characters that superhero comics will never bring back. This list included characters like Uncle Ben, Gwen Stacy, Jason Todd, Bucky Barnes, Batman and Superman's parents. Today, Jason Todd and Bucky Barnes are back from the dead, and even Superman's biological father, Jor-El, came back from the dead for a brief while. Characters like Gwen Stacy and Thomas Wayne have also been brought back in major ways, though in the form of alternate universe versions instead of simply resurrecting the original versions of the characters. Considering all of this, it brings up the question about whether deaths in superhero comics matter at all. It's very easy to say no, they do not matter. And you would honestly be right about that because yes, superhero deaths do not matter, especially for major characters, because the moment they are killed off, you know it is inevitable that they are going to bring them back. But I also want to say yes to this question. I think superhero deaths matter, and I believe that superhero deaths in comics have evolved and have to be judged by a new kind of criteria, which I will explore in a minute. First, let's talk about why deaths in superhero comics cannot stick. There are always some people who advocate for certain characters to be killed off and believe that some characters should never have been brought back from the dead. Hell, I personally believe that Barry Allen and Ben Reilly should never have been brought back, and I can probably justify as to why I believe that. But ultimately, everybody loves saying that about certain characters, but the moment it happens to a character that we personally care about and want more of, we go on the defense and argue about why the character should be back as soon as possible, simply because we miss reading about them and want more of them. It's natural for everybody to want more of their favorite characters. Almost every major or minor character in Marvel and DC, whether they are a superhero, whether they are a supervillain, whether they are a major or minor supporting character, whether they are an obscure character, whether they are a popular character or not, they all have their own fan bases, and that fan base demands more of those characters, even if they may be insignificant on a larger scale. Recently, DC Comics brought back Leon Harper, daughter of Arsenal aka Roy Harper from the dead. Was bringing back Leon that necessary to the overall DC universe? Not really, she's a minor supporting character with little significance. But to fans of Roy Harper, Green Arrow and Titans, the return of Leon Harper was significant and something they had been asking for over a decade. Every character who has ever been used in a significant capacity, and sometimes not even then, have their own group of fans, and fans always want to read more of their favorite characters, and that is never going to change. And that is ultimately why superhero comics can never permanently kill off their characters. And in the case of popular characters, well, you simply cannot let those characters stay dead for too long because they are the ones with the biggest fan bases and the obvious reason they are the money makers. The very first reaction people have today when they hear about a death in a Marvel or DC story is, when are they coming back? Because everybody knows that these characters are going to come back sooner or later. It is inevitable, and the people working on these comics also know that by now. So what exactly is the point of these deaths? I think superhero deaths have evolved in two different ways, and I want to explore those two different methods using some examples. The first method has to do with the execution of the death, the aftermath of the death, and the return of the character. These are the factors I primarily look at when I judge the merit of a superhero death. Just because the character is inevitably going to come back does not mean the process has to be sloppy. Superhero deaths have to matter when it happens. They have to be emotional affairs that are treated as the significant events they are. The deaths should be executed in a way that does justice to the character being killed off, irrespective of whether it is meant to be a heroic sacrifice or a tragedy. It needs to matter. A great example for this phenomenon would be Human Torch's death in Hickman's Fantastic Four run. Human Torch got to make an epic heroic stand against the Annihilation Wave, and it was a fantastic, heartbreaking death. The run built up to his sacrifice, and the emotional impact of it managed to land perfectly. The run also took the time to explore how Johnny's death affected his family and friends, and show their reactions, and the stories following that continued to explore how much his absence affected the others. His return from the death was also handled well with the appropriate emotional tension, and the whole affair felt satisfying, even if we all knew from the start that he was always going to come back. His death meant something, and his return meant something. That is what really matters at the end of the day for a superhero death. At the same time, I also want to be frank here. These deaths can sometimes be very cheap gimmicks trying to capitalize on the attention that deaths of superhero characters always manages to get. Too often, we witness cheap deaths that do not achieve the bare necessities, making the deaths entirely pointless. Sometimes, a superhero death can achieve one thing but not the other. The death of Wolverine in 2014 was handled perfectly, and the story had the necessary emotions, and it felt like a meaningful end to the character. The aftermath was also done well, as we got to see how so many different characters react to the death of Logan and how he had impacted them. But when Wolverine was eventually brought back, he got a written storyline that was so convoluted and stupid and longer than necessary, which reduced the impact of his return from the death. Another example would be the death of Magneto in the pages of X-Men Red. His death was an epic emotional tribute to the character. But the aftermath of the death fell flat, as we barely got to see anybody, even his family, properly react to his death, which came across as a huge missed opportunity. Then you have examples like the death of Alfred, where his death felt like pure shock value meant to fasten the story, but writers managed to explore the aftermath of his death in meaningful ways from the perspective of different characters. And finally, the recent death of Miss Marvel stands as one of the worst ways to execute a superhero death. Her death was pure shock value and came out of nowhere. We barely got to witness how her friends reacted to her death because she was immediately brought back in a way that was utterly lifeless. It was just really badly done on all fronts. Another excellent example for this would be the recent death of Justice League storyline that led to Dark Crisis. These are the worst kind of superhero deaths, as nothing really matters in storylines like this. Not the death, not the aftermath, not the return. Deaths in comics matter when you look back at the storylines featuring the deaths of these characters with fondness. There should be emotional, memorable scenes that will be remembered even after the characters are back. That is when you know that the superhero death matters. Otherwise, it is just a waste of time and a matter of shock value and nothing more. Deaths in superhero comics don't matter, so why not simply take advantage of it? That is also a unique method that has been used by some writers in recent years. Instead of having readers wonder whether the certain death matters or when the characters will eventually return, especially when readers already know that deaths are ultimately meaningless, some writers have chosen to make those deaths an integral part of their stories and have begun to use the deaths of characters as storytelling devices. There are two fantastic examples for this from Marvel: the Immortal Hulk and the Krakoa era of X-Men. The Immortal Hulk firmly established the Hulk and other Gamma beings as immortal beings able to come back sooner or later from the dead, and use that to influence the characters and the storylines, and to deliver some excellent horror panels to showcase the inherent horror of the many deaths of the Hulk and the many painful returns of the character. This removes the illusion of death from readers and draws their attention to the story, which is what ultimately matters. Similarly, the Krakoa era of X-Men brought about the concept of resurrection for mutants, which led to an unique status quo that explored whether death had any meaning if you could be easily resurrected. These kind of stories urge you to not take the deaths seriously and instead focus on how these deaths can be vital to the story and how you can tell refreshing new stories using the concept of deaths instead of having readers pretend to care about a meaningless storyline where yet another character dies and eventually comes back. As time passes, I think there will be more such storylines like these, challenging the very concept of death as a final end and evolving them into storytelling devices to tell new stories set in unique status quos. There are a lot of factors to deaths in superhero comics, and each and every case can be considered unique in their own right. One thing that every death should consider is how long the death will last for. Sometimes it is meant to last for a long while, and even the writer would not have an idea for when the character will be back. Sometimes the writers get to craft the death knowing exactly when and where the character will make their return. But ultimately, deaths matter when they last for a while. Logan's death was impactful because it actually lasted for a few years. If a character does not stay dead at least for 1 or 2 years, it is hard to justify the necessity of that death in my opinion. Because there is nothing to do if a character dies and comes back in 1 or 2 issues. It's useless. There is also another thing that impacts these deaths, other than popularity, which we all know is the ultimate factor. Is the death featuring a superhero or a supervillain character or just a civilian character? Superheroes and supervillains tend to return at faster rates because, well, it is easier to justify it. It is harder to do that with civilian characters, and that is why the deaths of civilian characters tend to last for a significant while, even though in the case of popular supporting characters, we know that they will eventually come back somehow. The death of Alfred Pennyworth has lasted for years now, and we all know that he will eventually come back. But the reason why I believe it has lasted for this long is because Alfred is not a traditional superhero character. Marvel has repeatedly tried to kill and sideline Mary Jane Watson, but has never managed to do it because she is too popular to be permanently killed off. Leon Harper returned after a decade and stayed dead for that long because she is ultimately a civilian supporting character, even if she is a vital character in Green Arrow and Titan stories. Sometimes writers get to kill off characters without actually killing them off. A certain character is assumed dead by the larger Marvel or DC universe, but their stories are told in their own books. This allows writers to simultaneously tell stories about the characters while also having their death be a major plot point that affects other characters and the wider universe. Deaths of big characters can also be a great way to let some underrated characters get a moment to shine and give them the solo spotlight for a short while. The recent death of Doctor Strange allowed Clea to get a solo book for the very first time, and in a refreshing change of pace, we got to see how she handles being the Sorcerer Supreme of Earth and how other heroes reacted to having a more brash and stubborn Sorcerer Supreme than they were used to. You could argue that they could simply push the character without an unnecessary death, but superhero deaths always grab attention and the spotlight, so it is the perfect gimmick to try things like these. But there is also another thing to be considered. What happens if the successor manages to surpass the predecessor after their deaths? This is what happened in the cases of Barry Allen and Ben Reilly. Wally West's stories are the Flash stories that are responsible for almost 90% of Flash lore, and Wally West has cemented himself as the definitive Flash for multiple generations, before DC brought back Barry Allen at the behest of certain nostalgia-driven executives. This happened right before the big superhero boom of the 2010s, which ended up making Barry Allen the most popular Flash. The Spider-Man clone Ben Reilly died in the 90s Clone Saga, and the other Spider-Man clone Kane died soon after. But around the 2010s, Kane was resurrected and given a redemption arc where he became the new Scarlet Spider. This development was warmly received by fans, and Kane managed to surpass Ben Reilly and cement himself as the new Scarlet Spider, even though Ben was still generally known among more casual audiences as the Scarlet Spider due to other media appearances. Despite this, Marvel inexplicably brought back Ben Reilly, and Kane slowly began to lose the spotlight. And aside from a few cameo appearances, Kane ended up becoming a throwaway character while Marvel started using Ben regularly, even if the treatment of the character wasn't exactly that good. In cases like these, superhero deaths allow other characters to flourish and eventually surpass their predecessors, and bringing back those predecessors ends up harming the successors and reducing the spotlight they managed to get only because they had the solo spotlight during that time. Another way to make superhero deaths matter is by telling alternate universe stories. In these worlds, you do not have to be beholden to any rules, so you can get nuts and kill characters and allow them to actually stay dead. And you can use the to explore the impact of the death of those characters in a way that you never can in main universe comics. While this has been used as a gimmick for shock value and gory alternate universe stories, there are certain stories which are able to use the permanence of superhero deaths in these worlds to tell interesting, unique stories that can never be told in the main universe comics, because you can never really permanently kill off characters in the main universe. There is an excellent comic that I wanted to highlight that actually tackles this topic of superhero deaths from the perspective of the Marvel Universe. Secret Avengers issue 15 by Nick Spencer and Scott Yeaton. In the aftermath of the death of Bucky Barnes, Natasha Romanoff, aka the Black Widow, confronts a group of journalists who claim that Bucky's death was a hoax because they wanted their site to get more internet traffic. When Natasha angrily asks them to take it down, a civilian mocks her for it and brings up the many instances of superheroes returning from the dead and claims that Bucky will eventually return from the dead as well, and that the only deaths that really matter are the deaths that the people like her face. It is certainly a valid point, right? To this, Natasha is forced to give a response that I think works as a serviceable explanation for why superhero deaths kinda matter even if they eventually come back. First, she brings up that dying is a traumatic affair that will haunt the returned people for the rest of their lives, much like the way people in car accidents will always feel a bit jittery whenever they get into a car. Next, she talks about the complications of coming back. Returning to a different world where the people you love have moved on and changed and built new lives for themselves can be really complicated. She brings up how death in a lot of ways is meant to be closure for people. For a normal person, you grieve and you then move on. But if you knew there was a chance that they would eventually be able to come back, would you ever really be able to move on? Even after all that, you can still say, yeah, but you get to be alive again. So it matters. So that's cancels it out, right? But if you ask me, there are some excellent points made by this comic to justify why these deaths still matter in superhero comics and why they can be more than just a gimmick, and the potential things that can be done with a superhero death. And I really appreciate this comic for trying to explore a topic like this in such a meta way, even though it still feels a bit odd. It is very easy to dismiss superhero deaths, and considering how badly Marvel and DC have used this gimmick at times, I think it is justified to feel that way. There are very few deaths that still matter in comics, and even then, who knows how long those deaths will matter. At the same time, I think comic fans have mostly learned that deaths have evolved in comics, and that what really matters is how the deaths are executed rather than focusing on whether they stick, because at the end of the day, we all know that they won't. I believe death in superhero comics still matter. I just think that they have evolved into something else, and that it is necessary for the method of evaluation of these kind of storylines to evolve as well. Sure, there will always be cheap gimmicks hoping to grab headlines, but there are also several stories where deaths are executed in interesting new ways that allow for new kind of stories. I think that the concept of death as storytelling devices will keep evolving, and who knows what the future has in store, because I think more and more writers will come up with brand new methods to tackle the concept of death instead of regarding it as a final end, because superhero comics cannot regard it as a final end. Anyways, I hope this video managed to give you a new perspective about deaths in superhero comics and how they have evolved in recent years, and maybe encourages you to look at it in a different way the next time you hear Marvel and DC is killing off a character, or you read a story where a big character is killed off for some reason. Thank you for watching.